Ready?
Yeah.
We're going to do math now. We're going to do some math. Okay. Now, you know, you have a graph, right? And then, let's say we have a line. Okay. Now, you know the line has a slope, right? Bends up, bends down. And in order to find the slope of the line, you need 2 points. Right. So there's ways to, you know, once you have a line and you know any 2 points on the line, you can find the slope. Right. And why might you want to know the slope of the line? Because it tells you where everything else is. Right. Once you've got the slope, you can tell where all the other points are on the line. Okay. Slope. That's what slope does. Now,
Slope means
slope is the
Helning.
yeah.
Vinkel? No, no, er det ikke helning?
with angle.
Yeah.
Right. Angle. Yeah.
Angle, vinkel,
Yeah.
helning.
But you guys, I mean,
Hellings coefficient. Yeah.
didn't you?
Sådan. Ej.
Did you guys do some geometry? Come on, you guys did geometry. Didn't you do geometry? Didn't you learn slope, right? Didn't you learn like y equals mx plus b,
Yeah.
right? Where m is the slope?
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course. Yeah, good. This is it. This is all we're talking about. The slope. We're talking about the m. Okay?
Hellings coefficient.
Was it?
Hellings
Now we know the word Helling's coefficient. We
Okay.
learned it. Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. And why do you want to know what m is? Because that way you can tell what else is on the list. Okay, here's the problem. Right. Suppose you have not one of these, but you have like one of these. Okay? Right. And let's suppose you're over here. Okay? Now, you want to know where things are going. You can't pick this here, this point, because what you're going to get is this. And that's not the same thing as the curve. Right? So what you've got to do here is you don't have your second point. And if you don't have your second point, you can't find out where your slope is. And if you can't find out what your slope is, then you can't tell what's going to be happening on this line. Right? You can't tell where it's going next. Right? So far, so good, right? Okay. So there is a way of doing this. We don't have to worry about what that way is, right? There's a way of doing this. And the way of doing this, the way of taking a point on a curved line and trying to and finding out what's going to happen, right? The study that does that is called differential calculus. Right? That's what differential calculus does.
Differentialligning.
Er det det? Differentialligning.
Yeah. That's differential calculus talks about how you find on a curved line what's going to happen. So it gives you, differential calculus gives you a formula. Right. But it's a system. Again, we don't have to worry about how it works, right? It's a system to come up with a formula, give it a point on a curve, to be able to tell where that curve's going. Okay? So what you do is you start with a point. Okay? And from the point, you create a formula that gives you a set of relationships to what's going on around it. Okay? You start with a point, and you come up with a set of relationships, right? That is coming that with the points around it. Okay? Now, there's some. So far, so good, right? Okay? Not so scary. That doesn't get any worse than this, right? You could go the other way around. In other words, you can start with formulas and construct figures from there. And the name for that is integral calculus. Integral calculus works starting with the formulas and working back to the points. So, I'm going to put this same point another way. What differential calculus does is it starts with particular points and derives the relational field. The relations, right? That's the formula, right? The relations that are there. such that that point can come out. Okay? Integral calculus, right, starts with the set of relationships and derives the point. Now, so far so good, right? Okay. I'm going to put this another way, right? Differential calculus starts with an actual point and moves backwards to the differential field that generated that actual point. Okay. Starts with an actual point, there's the point, and then moves out to the differential field, the relational field that generated that point.
Starts with an actual point, moves out to the...
We could say the relational field, right, that generates it. The mathematical field, the mathematical set of relationships that generate that point. Integral calculus starts with the relational field, starts with the formulas. And here's where the game gets given away. It starts with the formulas and then sees what points can be actualized from those formulas. So differential calculus works by differentiation. Right? It sees the actual and looks for the virtual beneath it. Integral calculus works by what they call integration, it's a technical term. Starts with the differential field and sees what points can be actualized from it. And in difference and repetition, I spared you the first 15 pages, I think, of the 4th chapter, which are about differential and integral calculus. Right? It is a virtual actual interpretation of differential and integral calculus. Okay? But he sees calculus as working the same way all this other stuff's been working. Right? Through differentiation and differentiation. So let me stop. That's all the math, right? Do you see that? Should we linger over that? What should we do? Yes, Mary, you feel, yes?
Yeah, say a bit more about that.
Oh, yes, say a bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Can you tell me where you feel uncomfortable?
Well, I just don't quite get it.
Okay.
So,
Let me ask you this. Did you feel comfortable when I talked about you can move from the point that the differential calculus tells you the slope at a certain point?
yeah,
That was okay,
yeah.
right? And that from integral calculus you start with the formula, you generate a point?
Well, it was from when you said this about the differential calculus is then is same as differentiation and integral calculus and differentiation.
Oh, this is the last part.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the math part feels comfortable,
Yeah.
right? Like you see, you get a point, you use differential calculus, it tells you the slopes, you can see what else is on the line, or you can start with integral calculus, you start with formulas, you plug in numbers, and then you get specific points,
Yeah.
right? That's straightforward, right? Okay, no, if that's straightforward, the rest is easy, right? So I'm not going to do it. No, okay, so we have that, okay? Now think of it this way. That what integral calculus does is it starts with, say, a set of formulas. But the formulas are abstract in general, right? Those formulas won't give you a specific graph. There isn't any specific curve that will come from these formulas.
In itself.
In itself.
Yeah.
Right. So you start putting in numbers. And as you put in numbers, you get specific curves. You generate curves. Right. Good so far, right?
Yeah.
Right. That curve that you generate is an actualization of that formula. You've moved from the formula to its actualization in a specific curve. That formula is, we could say, a problem that could have many different solutions depending on the numbers you plug in. But you plug in one set of numbers and you get a specific curve. You get an actualization of that formula, which itself is very abstract.
Could you say it's virtual?
Yes, the formula. The formula is virtual. The curve is an actualization of the virtual formula. Or we could put it another way, right? That the formula is the virtual of a number of curves, depending on what numbers you plug in. And those curves are the actual, or different actualizations of that virtual formula.
But why is it not possible? Don't you know all the possibilities of the...
Ah, good question. No, because there's an infinite number of numbers that you can plug in. Right, so you can't know all, because of the way math works, right? You can't actually know all the possibilities. Right? It's got to be infinite. Does it make sense? Yeah. Right. So now that's integration. This is, we start with the abstract, we start with the virtual, and we actualize curves from it. The other way of moving is we start from the actual points on an actual curve and see, right, what the formulas are, what the formula is, such that this was a particular solution. What is the problem to which this became one solution? So we're moving back to the virtual, right, from the actual. We're starting with an actual curve and asking, what is the virtual of which this was one actualization? Differentiation, right? So the formula is the differentiation. This curve is one differentiation of that differentiated
So over there,
formula.
you go to the left, the right, formula and curve.
Yeah, this would be formula, right? And this would be the curve. Okay? That says formula. That says curve. Sorry for that. Now, Maria, I'm going to check in with you because you'd asked about that. How's it feeling right now? Good. Good? Does everybody feel comfortable? You see what's going on here, right? Right. And Deleuze's idea, I mean, one thing that makes this fascinating, right, is that you begin to, like, when you see this stuff, right, it's like you see, like, everything looks like a Deleuzian world, right? Because he does it in biology, he does it in math, he does it in language, he does it all over the place, right? And then all of a sudden it all looks Deleuzian, right? And here's, like, this is one, there were two places where I just thought, oh, I get what he's doing now, right? And one was science, right? The bit about the blue and the red, right? Oh, when I was studying science, there was one place. And then somebody explained, like if you look at my edition of Difference and Repetition, like the first 15 pages has no underlining, right? Because I had the faintest idea what was going on. And there was this mathematician, Deleuze guy, who's a mathematician, and he actually has, I have an article somewhere that he gave this talk. And he says, oh, this is how it works. I'm like, oh, okay, I get it now. Right? Now his was a little more detailed, but that part I don't all get all myself. But this part I get, right? This is how it works, right? And so now you see again that same structure recurring: biology, the environment, right? Conversational work, mathematics, right? You see the same structure of the virtual and its actualization. Now, right, so the one thing that we have left, right, is this. It won't take us terribly long, but before we do that, right, questions, thoughts, right, stuff that's going on. Matthias, yes.
Can you make infinite actualizations from the virtual? Why is it that
Yeah. let me. Yeah. No, it's a really good question, because the idea is that doesn't this seem to go to anything can happen at any moment,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And the answer is no, right? But now the question is, why is the answer no, right? Let me give you what Deleuze says about what can happen, and then explain why it's that. Okay. In some cases, right, the case that Maria brings up with the differential calculus, that you do actually have infinite solutions. Okay. But most of the time, what Deleuze says is not that anything can happen, but that we don't know what can happen. Right. That more can happen than we're aware of. But now the question is, why does it get to say that and not anything can happen? Okay? And this goes back to the structure of the virtual and the actual. Right? The virtual fields are specific fields. Okay? Now think of it this way, right? That formula we talked about, right? That's a virtual field. But from that formula, you can't just generate any curves. Maybe let's say you could generate this. You might be able to generate this, right? But from that formula, you probably can't generate one of these. Right.
So there's more virtual fields at the same time.
Yeah, right. It isn't there's sort of one single one, right?
Okay.
It's like all of reality has virtual fields, right?
Yeah.
Within it. Okay. Now, with that in mind, then every virtual field can be actualized in a number of ways. But we don't know how many ways. Right? We do know in the math case, but we just know it's infinite. Right? But so in the case, let's say, of an an ecological system, right? We talked last time, it generates the zebra, right? This ecological system. Right? It wasn't like the zebra had to come out, right? Like there are probably different ways things that could happen. That's the idea. You run a tape backwards, you run it forwards. It would be different. Right? We don't know what else could have been generated, right, aside from the species of a zebra. Right? Many other things could have been generated. We don't know what, and we don't know how many. But not anything could have been generated. Because the actual condition, the virtual was a virtual of a particular actual that had a structure. Remember I said a little bit earlier that the actual structures the virtual, just as the virtual expresses itself in the actual. So the ecological field out of which the zebra emerges is a field that didn't have to yield a zebra, right? But, right, let's say it couldn't have yielded the Empire State Building, right? Right. Only certain things can be yielded, right? Think of another, right? In a football game, okay? Right? Football games, the virtual field tied up with a football game can yield many different possible plays, right? But it won't yield, let's say, people turning into soldiers, right? So not anything can happen, right? What can happen is structured by that now virtual / actual field that exists, okay? So we shouldn't think of the virtual field as a field, we could say, Alan used the word earlier, chaos, a field of chaos that can generate anything, but a structure field wider than the actual field that can actualize itself in ways beyond what we know, right? That we can't simply derive them, right? But, as we would be able to derive a set of possibles. Keep going, it's got a question behind it.
Is there any way to describe what sets the limit? Can you say?
No.
You can't say
No.
about what the limit is.
No, I mean, you can say some things about what clearly are not going to happen,
Yeah.
some things about what could happen,
Yeah.
but you can't say where the limit is,
Yeah.
right? Because to say where the limit is would be to say we know what can and cannot be created.
Yeah.
And if we knew, then they'd be possibles, right? There'd be a set of possibles that we could delimit, right? So it can't, we can't know, right?
Okay.
And that's why Deleuze often quotes Spinoza, right? And Spinoza's phrase, right? We don't know of what a body is capable. We don't know what a body is capable of, right? And the idea is, right, not simply that we don't happen to know, right? But there's always more, right? And even if, now this is going to be not a Deleuzian thought, but this is not a Deleuzian thought, but you imagine this, even if we had exhausted all the possibilities, we probably wouldn't be able to know that we had exhausted all the possibilities, right? Because how would we know? The virtual field isn't their actual, hasn't been actualized to where we can investigate it, right? That's why he keeps saying that we can sense it, right? We sense it, but we can't bring it in front of us, right? We can't investigate it the way we can investigate what is actual.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Steen.
I know there's not a lot of time. But
No, we're good.
I was very curious about this, and you talked a little bit about it before, and it might be what he's referring to as in this chapter we read today, reciprocal determination. The movement from the actual to the virtual.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah. He uses the term reciprocal determination. I can say a little bit, but given what he's saying, I can only say a little bit because the reason is there's only a little bit to be said, right? He talks about reciprocal determination of the actual and the virtual, right? That's to say, the actual helps determine the virtual helps determine the actual. That's the reciprocal part, right? Back and forth determination. Determination of the actual by the virtual by the actual, right? And what I take him to mean is that it's not a one-way thing where you just have a virtual that just keeps expressing itself, right? If that were the case, then, right, Matthias, then if it were the case like that, then I think Deleuze would have exactly the problem you're talking about, right? If there were a virtual field that actualized itself without the actual affecting the virtual, then it would seem like anything can happen, right? But the idea is that, right, the virtual expresses itself, actualizes itself, and changes the character of the actual. Now you have a new actual, but that new actual also helps determine what the character of the virtual field is. So go back to our football game, right? In the football game, you have an actualization. You know, something happens, players do some things, you have an actualization, and now you have a new actual field. But that actual field helps determine the structure of the virtual. Right? It's entirely possible, right, that what could have happened at the moment of the first actualization can't happen after that second actualization has occurred. That's to say, before the play, right? Before the play, you've got a bunch of people in different positions, right? And in those different positions, there's a virtual field. A number of things can happen. But then something happens. Right now you have, let's say, the second or a new actualization. That new actualization is going to carry, right, its virtual field. A number of things can happen, but those things that can happen will not be the same things that could have happened, right, at the start of the first play. Right. So in that sense, the actual structures the virtual. It determines the virtual, just as the virtual determines the actual. Right. So we shouldn't think of determination as that strict causality, but sort of as a more broad structuring. Okay? And as I read reciprocal determination, that's what I think he's on about. Right? And I think of it in terms of plays like that. And you can think of it otherwise. Right? We used the idea of weather, right? That when a weather system develops, take the weather system as evolving a virtual field, and then something happens. You get rain, right? But what happens after the rain? There's all kinds of other things that can happen, but not the same things that happened before the rain.
And the same goes for the zebra.
Yes, right. Once you get the zebra, you change. This is a great bit because once you get the zebra, you change the environment, right? And now the environment's structured differently, right? And you can't get the same things that you could have gotten before the zebra showed up. Exactly. Right. Good. Steen, does that help? Good. Matthias, you feel comfortable with that?
You can't get into the same river twice.
Say what?
You can't go into the same river twice.
Right. Right. But if Deleuze is right, the river's a lot more interesting than you think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Right? So good here. Okay? Good. Let's just spend a couple of minutes on this, right? And then we have cake. Okay. dramatization. And the reason we only need to spend a couple minutes on this now is that this is going to be this is what we're going to talk about next time. Actually, dramatization. He says actualization occurs through. He uses the term dramatization, and then he has that phrase which, right, I'm sure stood out for you. Right, the world is an egg. He said. Right? So the world is an egg. And he's got several things. Actually, let me read this quote. For us, it's on 214. No, not on 214. 216. Yeah, 216. Okay. And I want to unpack. I'm going to sort of read and unpack as we go. Okay. Right.
216 in your.
216 an hour. So where?
That's in the chapter.
It's
4.
It is 5 pages from the end of chapter 4. He says the entire world is an egg. Just call it out when you get it.
281
Ja.
øverst i
Yeah.
den her.
Yeah. The entire world is an egg. 281.
Good. And Thomas and Steve, do you want to get yours?
I wasn't lost.
Was that? About 5 pages from the end.
Just go.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. The entire world is an egg. Right? He says the double differentiation of species and parts, qualities and beings, right? Right? Always presupposes spatio-temporal dynamisms. Differentiation. Okay? So think of the egg, right? What does the egg do? Right? The egg becomes a chicken, right? But in becoming a chicken, right? That egg is a virtual field. And I think the egg is a nice image here because, like, what could resemble a chicken less than an egg, right? So the egg is the virtual field that becomes the chicken. So, right. So the double differentiation of species and parts always presupposes spatial temporal dynamisms. Okay. Now skip down. But 8 lines. They are precisely dramas. What occurs is a drama. The actualization is a drama. They're precisely dramas. They dramatize the idea. Remember, don't forget the term idea. Just keep the term problem. Right. They dramatize the problem. Right. On the one hand, they create or trace a space corresponding to differential relations, right, and to the singularities to be actualized. I'll hold singularities. I'll come back to that. Okay. Then, about 4 lines down, the world is an egg, but the egg itself is a theater. By the way, mixed metaphor, I'm not keen on this particular sentence, but at least it does what it's supposed to do. The world is an egg. The egg itself is a theater, a stage theater in which the roles dominate the actors, the spaces dominate the roles, and the ideas, the problems dominate the spaces. Right? That's to say, right? It's a theater in which the actors, those are the individuals, right, are dominated by roles, right, which they somehow instantiate, right? Those roles occur in a space. And what that space is helps determine what those roles are. Right? And those spaces are determined by problems. They're problematic fields that determine that space. Right? And that's how dramatization works. So dramatization is actualization. And then what he'll talk about next time is here's the question, okay, how does this work? Okay. So let me say one more thing, right? And that's, Alan, we'll come back to singularities because he uses that term a lot. Right? It is a I was going to talk about it here. I forgot. The term singularities he draws from mathematics. In mathematics, there are formulas that somehow sort of generate unexpected results that can't be brought into the formulas, and he calls those singularities. Right. In logic of sense, he uses the term singularity to refer to events. Right. Sort of bendings of things that aren't predictable on the basis of whatever formulas you've got, and it emerges from math in ways that honestly I couldn't even begin to understand. And I don't think it's a worry for Deleuze in terms of understanding Deleuze, because all he does is he borrows the term to indicate the idea, right? So a singularity then is a point at which something happens that wasn't predicted by the structure, the actual structure. Good. Now, with that in mind, we now have a sort of the entire structure with one question left. How does actualization work? Right? And what I want to do next time is talk about that, right? But also talk about, bring it back, right, again to conversational work, right? Which we talked about last time. Today was very conceptual. We'll bring that back and see how this stuff works, right? Conversation, right? Because your conversations are, right? If Deleuze is right, actualizations, dramatizations, right, of a virtual field, right? Which is to say, right, that your relationship with your conversational partner is an egg. Good? Let's have cake.
That's a new concept of communication.
Actually, I was going to start by doing something that was going to lay the groundwork for next time, which was that for people to suggest concepts in Deleuze that they've read about, that they want to connect up. But I think I'll wait because Thomas and Steen are not here, and they'll have stuff as well, so maybe we'll wait a little bit. Okay. So, what I want to do today is pick up from last time, right? Do a review of where we were last time. For some folks, right, folks in the psychology, this is going to, you're sort of diving in the middle. So, and I kind of apologize for that. But we'll just hope it gets picked up as it goes along. Okay. So last time, right, we worked on a set of distinctions, right, and they were all equivalent distinctions, right. There was the virtual, right, versus the actual. Right? There were problems, right, and solutions. Right? There was differentiation, right, with a T, and differentiation with a C. Right? There was then the calculus differentiation and integration. Right? And we saw, right, that they were all equivalent. Right? And in looking at those, then we saw that what happens is that there's this realm of difference, a realm that isn't a realm of identities. And that realm that isn't a realm of identities, right, actualizes itself, right? It's a problematic field that solves itself one way or another into identities, right? But those identities, hey, come on in. Those identities carry with them the notion of difference, and the question that was left over, and this is the question that we're going to try to solve today, is the question of how is it that the virtual moves into the actual? How does that process occur? How does difference actualize itself? Right? And the answer that Deleuze gives, right? And Steen, this is where I'm going to come back to the question you raised the very first time, which is where are intensities, right? And the answer to how it happens is through intensities, right? So intensities are going to be in the virtual, right? But we're going to have to find out what they are and how they work, right? And that will be the key to how we move, right, from the virtual to the actual, okay? How we move from the realm of difference to the realm of identity. Now let me ask, before we start that, right? Questions, thoughts, anything left over from last time that we want to pick up on before we start? Okay, Charlotte's okay.
I wasn't here last time. So
That's right, okay.
you know.
Okay. Did you get a chance, did you see the notes or no? Okay, good. And some of this is also stuff that we had also, done. So it's subject to be a bit familiar, right? Good, okay. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, right, Deleuze says that difference in intensity, he says, is a tautology. Right? A tautology, what would be the Danish for tautology?
Altså, vi har ordet tautologi, det er noget, der er samsigende. Det er som at sige, rødt er rødt. Det siger ikke noget. It's saying the same.
Saying the same, right, saying the same thing, right? So he says the differences in intensity is a tautology, right? So, right, difference is somehow, right, a difference in intensity. Right? And yet he's introduced a new term, and this new term is the one we're going to spend today wrestling with. Right? What is the new term? How does it work? Right? And we're going to see several qualities it has. But before we do that, I want to get a sense of it, and I want to talk about different examples of it, some that he uses and some that he doesn't. Right? But think of it this way, right? You have the virtual realm of difference. It's a realm in which, right, you have no identities. Right? It's all, we could say, relations without any particular identity. The identities come later. Right? That's why identities are secondary. Right? But now, can we say anything about this realm of relations? And what Deleuze says, and this is the thing, again, this is the idea we're going to unpack, right? What Deleuze says is the realm of relations, right, is a realm that characterized by relations that are more or less intense. Right? They have greater or lesser intensity. So now the trick is to find out, right, what it is, what this intensity is, and then what happens to it, right? Because it's intensities, right, it's through intensities that actualization occurs. Or we could put it another way, right? You have two realms we've been talking about before, right? You have the virtual and the actual, right? The question is, how does the virtual actualize itself, right? And the answer is through intensities, okay? So the intensities are virtual, right? And the intensities, right? The intensities are virtual, they're not actual, right? Although they will give rise to the actual. Right? And the question is, how does that happen? Right? Would you guys mind if I took off this shirt? Okay. I know I do this. I just overdress is the problem. Okay. All right. All right. So, to begin to think about it, Deleuze says, right, and then we got to keep this in mind, right, that the virtual realm of difference is a relational realm. The idea of positive terms, right, particular elements, right, is not going to appear so much in the realm of difference because those would be identities. And remember, it's difference always below the identity. So you want to think of, if there are terms, they are terms simply defined by a set of dynamic and changing relationships. Right, now let me stop and hold that thought for a minute, okay? Because then we'll talk about intensity as characteristic of these relationships, right? Right. Does it make sense, right? When we've talked about this realm of difference, right? Realm of difference does not have particular positive terms because it can't have particular positive terms because those particular positive terms will be identities, right? And the identities are produced by this realm, okay? Identities are secondary. The idea, go back to this, the idea of Deleuze as a founder of, we could say, or a founding theorist out of which narrative work comes. What does narrative work deny? That we have these deep identities that it's our job to discover, right? But rather it sees, right, the work as a work of creation. If it's a work of creation, right, it's got to create out of something. But it can't create out of identities, right? Because otherwise you're just discovering, right? So you're creating out of this realm of difference. So now, in thinking about this realm of difference, right, difference is going to have a set of relations, right, in which anything that we might call a positive term, right? Relations between what, right? Right, those terms will simply be whatever falls out of the relations themselves. Right. let me stop. And no, I know people here have been here a lot, and people who've not been a lot. I want to check in just a couple of folks and see. Benedicta, okay, yes, no, okay. So far, that's okay. Take it a step at a time, right? So this is the Alcoholic Anonymous of Deleuze, right? It's one lesson at a time, right? Gilles, okay, I know you missed last time, but is this okay? Because you okay. Stephen, you feel? Yes, no.
I'm just wondering about the ideas.
Okay.
In this chapter we read today.
Yeah.
We have to read today.
Yeah.
He's talking about
Ideas?
all the time.
Yeah. Oh, ideas?
Are they part of the virtue realm of difference?
Yeah, ideas. It could be. Remember we had the four last time, right? Ideas are they're the virtual, right? He's borrowing the term from Kant, but using it in his own way, right? So it's the idea is the virtual, right? Those are the virtual multiplicities that have intensities. Okay, so for the term ideas, you can simply just substitute virtual. It'll work.
But what I'm interested in is, does the ideas in themselves, these multiplicities, are they something as opposed to nothing? It doesn't mean that they are identifiable identities, but somehow I have the feeling when I read it that they are something.
Yeah, they are, right? They're there, right? They exist, right? Remember last time we talked about the virtual is unlike the possible because it's real?
Yeah.
So it's real. The field is there, right? To see it, let me start with examples, okay? I think we'll begin to see the sense in which it is really there, right? Without being a something in the traditional sense, okay? All right.
But I thought that ideas would be actual because they are there. It's actually an idea.
But he uses, when he capitalizes idea, right? He's using it he's borrowing it from Kant, and then he's changing it up. So the ideas are what are behind things, right? So for him, the term idea, right? Not as, let's say, idea as opposed to concept is a technical term, okay? Right. And when you use the term idea, he would use the term concept for that, and concepts are actual. Okay. Now.
Because the way that Plato uses it, he would use the.
Oh, it's right. For Plato, they will be actual.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So, right, I want to run through 4 examples, right? And with the 4, hoping by the end of the 4 examples, then we start to get a picture of what's going on here, and then and why it is in a sense a something. Okay. Let me start with one of his examples. Okay. He talks about temperature. Right? Now, temperature measures, right, relations of energy between things. Okay? The relations of energy, the relations themselves, are not things, but the energy they create is something that happens between them, right? And what temperature seeks to do is measure, right, energy that's happening between things. Okay? Now, if there's enough energy between certain things, you may get a change of state. Okay? So, for instance, right, simple example, right? You have water molecules, right? Those water molecules are actual water molecules, right? You introduce energy, right? They develop intense relationships, right? At some point, those intense relationships can occur in such a way that there's a change of state. What was water, right, becomes gas, right? Becomes vapor, I guess. Right? So, right, the field of relationships among the water molecules, right, is a field, right, characterized by more or less intensity. And when there's enough intensity in the field, right, something breaks out, right, you have a change of state, water to water vapor. Right, let me we'll make sure that example is okay, right? So now, these relationships, right, are real, but we said the energy isn't a something in the traditional sense, it's the water molecules. What's defined is the field between them, right? And what Deleuze is interested in is this idea of the field between things, the field of relationships, okay? Remember, what happens, the water vapor, is a product of what's happening, right, within the field of relationships. The water vapor is produced by the field of relationships. All right, so far so good, okay? All right. Next example, or maybe, and this is one I want to use from narrative work, okay? You know how, if you have these sessions, sometimes in the course of a session, people will be talking, somebody will say something, right? And then somebody goes ballistic, right? Let's imagine this, right? You imagine it's a family session, right? Somebody says something and you had no idea, but let's say it's a family session and the dad goes ballistic, right? He starts screaming at the mother, right? You've always marginalized me, right? I feel outside the family, you don't care. And it seems like it's coming from nowhere, right? You've had this, right? Charlotte, I take that to be a yes.
Or we could have experienced it in other places.
We could have, but in the interest of leaving true confessions aside, right? So, what you think of this happening in a session, and think of it happening in a session. The one way to think of it, and Deleuze would say this is the wrong way to think of it, right? Would be that there's anger there. The anger already exists, and it sought an outlet, and it found an outlet at this moment, okay? Right, when this thing was said. Right? But what Deleuze is going to say is, do you really think there was anger just sitting there, right, waiting to come out? He says, it wasn't like that, right? Right? What was there was something different. Right? What you had was, right, a set of, we could say, fraught and intense relationships going on in the room, and something happened to actualize, right, that intensity in the form of anger, right, at that moment. But right, that it doesn't have to be anger that necessarily gets actualized out of that intensity. Something else could happen. Right? You could imagine the same level of intensity going on, and somebody says something, right, perhaps different, right? And instead of anger, right, you get, let's say, the father starts to cry. Right? Easy to imagine the turn. Right? So what was there previously wasn't sadness, right, and wasn't anger, right, but it was a field of relationships that had certain intensities at certain points that could break out, right, one way or another. Now, see, I'm going to come back. Can you see the idea that it's real, right, but it's not a something in the sense of a concept, right? I mean, if you ask, okay, what is it that's going on between the members of the family? What's this field like at this moment? Well, before something breaks out, the field doesn't have a particular identity, and there's no concept associated with it, right? It doesn't have a particular identity, right? It's an intensity that could move one way or the other, right? Or could actually be quelled. But let's say that it unfolds one way or the other, right? You have an intensity that unfolds one way or the other, right? And that intensity, right, is something that actualizes itself, right, in our example, in anger, right, although it might actualize itself in something else. Now, the trick in in thinking about this, right, is to think about it not as something that's already there, ready to come out, but as a virtual field of intensities that can be actualized in different ways. Right? And why that might be important is, right, that if you think therapeutically, right, if you think the anger is already there and it's just waiting to come out, you're going to do very different kind of work from if you think that what we have is a field of intensities that can be actualized in different ways, right? And in this instance was actualized as anger. Right? What do you do if you think the anger is already there? You follow the anger. Where did the anger come from? Right? Well, it came from the fact that you had an unresolved Oedipal relationship with your mother, and your father threatened to do things to you that we all know about from psychology graduate school, and that this was never completely resolved for you, right? So you had this anger, right? But if we think of this simply as a field that can, right, actualize in different ways, this opens up the possibility of other types of actualizations that will go along with other kinds of self-conceptions, right? What I am and what I'm on about, okay? Now, let me hold. Okay with the therapy analogy? Do you want to hang on to that?
Do you need an encounter to start this anger or whatever you say, or crying, or this reaction?
Do you need an encounter? Yes. I would think yes. Okay. It's a good question, Hillary, because it goes to also the question of the relation between the virtual and actual, doesn't it? Right? Let's put it this way. The answer is yes, right? And so I want to paint this picture, okay? Right? The virtual field, right, is a field of greater and lesser intensities. But remember, it's a dynamic and changing field, okay? Because it's a dynamic and changing field, right, that means that things could happen, right, either in the virtual or in the actual, that will bring it out, right, or perhaps quell it, right? Something can happen in the actual that something can happen in the actual, right, that turns down the intensity, right? So in the water example, right, you turn down the heat, right, and you've turned down the intensity, right? Or, right, something can be happening in the room, right, with the family, right, where what happens is somebody's noticing a rising intensity, right, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the counselor, right, does something to try to lower, right, the intensity level, okay, right, and you know how this happens because sometimes in families there'll be like the designated what would be the designated calmer of the waters, right, the person who gets nervous when things get kind of like out of hand or particularly intense, and they make things calmer, right. So something has to happen, okay? But in some sense, something's always happening, right? Because the virtual is always dynamic and changing, okay? So to think of these points of intensity, right? I mean, oops, wrong. Right pen, wrong pen? Okay, right. So if we think of these relations, okay? Think of these relations. Right? By the way, these are exact lines. Don't try to redraw this. Okay. That these are points of intensity. Okay. But these relations are constantly changing and shifting. So something could always happen. Does something have to happen in order for intensity to break out? Yes, but in some sense, things are always happening. Right? Or to put it in Deleuze, right? We're always in a process of becoming. Right. Charlotte, you had a thought.
Yes, did you just say that the actual does also affect virtual?
Yeah.
Because you said the heat, you could just turn down the heat, and heat is actual, so it would also affect the virtual.
Yes, right. Or another thing you can do, right? If we think of the energy level as sort of the virtual intensity, right? Another way to take that example, right? So we're not worried about which is the virtual, which is the actual, is you take a few pieces of ice, right? Actual ice. You throw it in, right, and you change the intensity level. Okay, right. So that would be an example as well, right? Yeah, the actual effects, right? The virtual. Think in the therapy example, right? Right. In the therapy example, you have these intensities, and somebody says something, right? That's actual, right? They're actual. Something has been said. Now there's something actual out on the table, a bunch of words out there. And that bunch of words may be the thing that brings out the anger, right? So something has to happen, but that something can be in the actual, or it can be a shift, right, in the virtual as well.
So the virtual is dynamic in it and changing in itself, but it also is also affected by the actual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one wants to say, well, this what that seems to make reality, right, is a very complex field, right, in which you have dynamic things going on beneath the level of identities, and the relationship with identities which are relatively stable but always carrying the virtual within them, and those identities can affect the virtual, right, and things can and if you say, well, that seems somewhat complicated, right? Deleuze's response is, welcome to reality, right? But if we think the alternative in for Deleuze is going to be, look, reality is, if we don't think of reality this way, then we're going to think of it in a very, a very rigid way. Here are just a bunch of identities, right? So the question is, how do we think of reality in such a way as we're not simply we're not simply looking for the identity that's there, trying to discover what it is that exists, but think of it as a realm of creation. Right? And what he's trying to do is give us a way of thinking that reflects the dynamics of all kinds of creation. Okay? Good. Other questions or thoughts at the moment? Right. Okay. Alan, am I moving back and forth too much?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. Another example.
I'm sorry.
Oh, jump in.
But I was just wondering from this question, does the virtual change because of the actual, because it changes in the actual, or can the virtual change in itself without any changes in the actual? Or is it always determined by reciprocal determination?
Yeah, both.
Both.
Yeah. So the virtual can change because of the structure of the actual, right? It could so something's produced, and that something that's produced reacts back, right? And you get a change, right? But it can also change in itself. Okay? There can be change. You want to think of the realm of the virtual as not a static realm, right? But a realm of say a dynamic realm. So it can change in itself, or it can change in relation to the actual.
I was just wondering, but if it can change too much by itself, it's almost a transcendent realm. That's if the virtual is a realm,
right?
It can change by itself without connection to the actual. It's almost like a transcendent realm.
No, but it changes. No, I see what you're saying, Steve. It changes. What any given thing that we recognize is, right? You, me, a set of relationships among people, right? That is an actual virtual, I don't know, combination, something like that, right? Right. And that actual virtual combination, right, is always a unity, right? And so. Now, let me go where I think your question is going. So no problem with the idea the actual could change the virtual, right? But it seems what you're asking, that the virtual can change itself without any effects in the actual. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, not can it change without the actual changing it, but can it change in such a way as not to affect the actual?
Yeah.
I got it? Question? Yeah. I want to make sure I'm getting the question. Yeah. Yes, right? I think the answer is still going to be yes, okay? but we got to be really careful about this because, right, when you change the virtual, right, what actualizes itself is the movement of intensities, okay? Right? So one might, let's say, imagine within the virtual, right, a raising or a lowering of a level of intensity such that it never breaks out into the actual, okay? So, and if that happens, then you have a change in the virtual that doesn't affect the actual. See what I mean? So it's going to be, if the actualization comes from intensities breaking out, right, then you can imagine something where the intensity gets raised or lowered at a certain point, or shifted at a certain point, without it actually affecting something that happened in the actual. And I'm trying to imagine if I can think of an example of something like this. Is that Helen?
It's a bit strange. Can't be like that. I don't think. Can it be like that? That you can change the virtual and then keep on all the intensities? No.
I think so. Yeah. So let's go back to the therapy example. Let's sort of think this through, right? With the therapy example, right? Right. So people in a room, right? Right. There are sets of intensities. Okay. Right. Now if somebody says something to bring the anger out or to calm the anger down, that's an actual affecting the virtual. Okay. Right. But I can let's imagine this. That the folks are sitting in the room, right? And there's a space in which, right, let's say, instead of something raising or lowering the intensity level, right, that discussion goes on, but it never really touches on what's those intensities. Okay, it sort of never touches on them, right? I can imagine a situation in which then, right, the intensity level changes, not because something has moved it, right, but just because in the unfolding of time, right, there has been a lowering. In other words, there's no particular change in the actual that's done it, right, but rather, right, time is unfolded and now there's sort of less, intensity, or we could say greater intensity if something's not getting addressed. Right? So that seems to me an example of a change in the intensity of a field without the actual actually doing anything, the actual actually changing it, right? And without it changing the actual. Does that seem like an example that works? Why not? Keep going. This is good.
Something must have happened in the actual, I guess.
I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure that it has to.
But doesn't it become? Is it still immanence? If the virtue can change by itself, it's like it's an independent realm. It's not dependent on the actual.
No, it's an interaction with the actual, right? But that to be an interaction, right, doesn't mean that an identity has to form. A particular identity has to form through every shift in the virtual, right? So was that?
It's a matter of degree.
That's it. It's a matter of degree, right? That's why you can have shifts in the virtual without the actual actually changing, right? Because the actual is something happens, something appears, right?
You could use the example with the water. It can raise from 20 degrees to 30 degrees. So it's a matter of degree, but there's no change in the actual, but a change in the intensity.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a bad example either, right? I mean, I like it. So the idea is there has to be something that happens, right? And without something that happens, things can happen in the virtual without the actual changing, right? But now let me use another example, right? Again, we're thinking about intensities here, right? And it came up. Actually, I was thinking about this a bit. See, you had said that I thought it was James Williams said that love was virtual. Was it?
With the love.
Yeah. Was he,
I don't know. We were talking about it last time.
no, this was like 3 times ago. Yeah? Was it you who told me that? That he thought love is virtual?
We were talking about the ideas.
Yeah. No, this was actually not in discussion.
No.
Okay. 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 All right. It's not a matter, right? Because I was thinking about this, right? All right. Let's take this phenomenon. And we will, I want to use and then, I'm going to use and then take back the word love. Okay? Right? Because I want to point at something, right? But the thing I want to point at, often people will call love. Right? But I want to unpack it in a way that it looks sort of different. And thinking about this, I want to think about what we would call a love relationship. In other words, love not as one person has for another, right? But a relationship that one might call, right, a relationship of love. Okay? Right. Now, in thinking about this, right, what might we describe? How might we describe this relationship? Well, one of the things that's going to characterize it is it's going to be a relationship of certain intensities between, let's say, the two people. And those intensities, right, may not always have a name that's easy to give to them. So, right, in this relationship of love, right, there is, and like I'm gonna say, every love song from the 1950s and early 60s tried to get at this, right? Things are happening, right, between people, right? And you might give it the name love, but put that aside and ask, what's happening between people, right? Well, you know, there's certain, right, we could say sometimes a certain electricity, right? Because you know when the person that you love is there, right? There's something that happens between you, right? Right, there's things like that happen. There are, right, we could say, right, when, right, let's say when you speak on the phone, right? Remember phones? People used to use phones, right? Right, there's this, you know, a certain something, right, that's going, that the voice back and forth, right, does something, right? Right, now, that something, we can say that energy field, right, between people is something that doesn't itself always have a particular name. We use the word love to sort of cover, you know, to say something about it, right? But in thinking about it, right, there's more, right? Because now imagine, right, with two people, right, and there is an intensity that's going to break out in a particular way. So, for instance, right, two people, right, sitting across the table from each other, right, and something happens to where one person reaches over and puts his hand, right, on the other person. Movement in the actual, right? We all see that. That's a movement in the actual, okay? And where did that movement in the actual come from, right? Well, what happened was there was a set of intensities going on between them, right? And that set of intensities was such that at a certain moment, right, it broke out into a movement in the actual. Right? Hey, Thomas.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. We're just talking about love, okay? Oh, nice. Right. It breaks out into the actual. Right? Now, and it's going to happen, right, in this particular relationship. Right? It happens in this relationship. Right? It won't happen sitting across the table from just anybody. Okay? Right. So, right, I mean, I have dinner with Alan. I enjoy having dinner with Alan. We have a great time. Right? One thing that's unlikely to happen is for me to reach across the table and put my hand on Alan's hand. Right? Love him like a brother, but
It could happen.
right?
We don't.
Okay. It's not going to happen. Okay. Okay. But now, right? Now let's go back to this term love. Right? right? Now I want to ask, right, what is the love part, right? And perhaps the love part is not just the feelings themselves, the intensities, right, which are often difficult to name and shifting, on the one hand, nor is it just the expressions, right? But we might say that love is the actual / virtual, right, whole itself of what is happening between what's happening between them, right? So love is not something that just happens in the actual, right? It's not something that just happens in the virtual, right? But the love is going to be, right, that it's going to involve a set of shifting and intense relationships, right? Virtual relationships that actualize themselves, right, in different ways and at different points, right? And you know how it is, right? When the hand thing, right? That what? Like the hand thing just seems innocent, doesn't it? Right? Look, I was born in '55. You know, it's a very innocent period. We don't know about this other stuff. What's that?
It's funny, yeah.
Okay, so, right, you imagine then that when this happens, right, that moment where you reach across, right, it's rarely, I mean, if it's a love thing, if it's not like a planned seduction, right, if it's a love thing, it's rarely that, okay, I guess now's the time, right? We've been talking for 15 minutes, and it emerges, right? It's something that feels. I can put it this way: it's something that may feel like it's happening to you, right? Rather than that you are doing it, okay? And when that happens, right? Then what Deleuze would say, right, is that an intensity, right, has actualized itself. At that point. But to understand it, right, we've got to keep understanding the notion of intensity as one that's in the virtual field. In other words, right, if we're going to say love is the whole thing, right, the intensities and their actualizations, then right, what we have to bear in mind is the notion of intensity isn't by itself the love, right? Or I'll come back to that. We would be misapplying the concept, right, if we just used it for the intensities. The intensities are the things that are difficult for us to name, right? Right. But they're the things that move us, right? Or that at certain points can move us to do certain things and can be more or less intense at certain nodes in the relationship of the field that is between people. Okay. Good.
But could you say that what happens between you and Alan in this example?
What's it with me and Alan?
You
want to come to dinner with us? Because we're going to have ourselves a good time.
I would love to do it with you. No, is it similar to because the water ice example is so much easier to understand because it's much more simple.
Yeah.
But is it kind of a phase shift? What you're talking about?
It is a phase shift. Oh, he uses the term phase shift. It is a phase shift. He also uses the mathematical term. It's a singularity, something that happens. Yes. The only thing I don't like about I like to work with the water example to start, right? The only thing that makes the water example, I mean, it's a good place to start, but in some ways we can say that there's the flame is actual. You can sort of all account for it a bit in terms of the actual, if you really pressed it, right? Whereas I think when we get to the therapy relationship and the notion of love, then it's much harder, right? But I think the reason they seem more complicated is because I think we're actually capturing the idea better with those examples than with the water example.
Exactly, but I understand because there's much more complexity.
There's more complexity, and I think sometimes the water example kind of lends itself to, well, isn't this all actual?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But what I mean, but the difference is that because there's so fewer variables in the water example. So also what Alan was saying was that even though that the water we know that it changes phase shift at 0 and 100 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, like 39 degrees is a change in the actual, but it's not a singularity. It is not an extraordinary point where it changes phase, but something happens. If it heats up the water,
Mhm.
the water is changing. It might not change. It doesn't happen a phase change.
Right, right.
It doesn't become air or it doesn't become
Right,
ice.
right,
It's
right.
still water. It's still the same water. It's just now it's warmer. But there is what I mean is there is a very easily detectable change in the actual, which is kind of leads to this phase shift. Which
Yes.
could be virtual. That's what I mean. That it makes a lot of sense for me to
Mhm.
think that there must be some change in the actual also, although that we cannot observe it or it's very difficult to observe. Like in the love example.
Mhm.
Like these things, other people can much more easily see if these things happens between two people.
Mhm.
They're usually not aware of it. Suddenly, wow, Jesus, this person is great. And
Right.
other people have been watching for a long time. They knew it already for a long time.
Mhm.
They could see it somehow.
Mhm.
Sense the intensity. So something was happening, but it came kind of was out of consciousness. A lot of things were happening.
Yeah, and so, and Steve, this is to press the point that that the change in the virtual are actually changing things in the actual, right?
Yeah, or that there's a
Well, we don't go
close
together.
relationship between because it's
Yeah.
it's an imminent relation.
Yeah.
Question of imminence.
Yeah, no, and that I think we agree on at least two things, right? One is the close relationship, right? And the other is that the actual can change the virtual, right? And what we're asking is, can there be shifts in the virtual, right, that don't have effects, right, in the actual, okay? And I think, the example, let's leave the water example aside, because remember, so you could sort of, the problem with the water example is going to look like it's all actual, right? So let's think of it, let's go to the love example, right? Right. One can imagine, I still think one can imagine changes in intensities, right, in the love example that won't have actual, that won't have like effects in the actual, right? So I'm trying to think of what would be a good example. One can imagine, right, and this is going to sound like a therapy example, though, right? Right. So the two are together, right, and they're talking, right, and at some point, right, a certain kind of leveling out happens. This doesn't have to happen, right? I mean, you can imagine getting more intense or less, but let's say a certain kind of leveling out happens, right, and that leveling out, right, is one in which you don't have sort of an increase in intensity, right? Maybe you have sort of a slight decrease in intensity, but that decrease in intensity is not one that's having effects on what's happening between them. There's a sort of a certain peacefulness that's between them, right? That that at that moment, right? There's a certain peacefulness that's between them that isn't that is in which the intensity is getting lowered, right? But not having any particular effects in the actual, right? I can imagine something like this, okay? See, the thing is that what we're talking about now, right? As we talk about this, are relationships. Hey, come on in, right? That are relationships where we're already at sort of at particularly intense moments, right? So one can imagine, let's say, an intensity that's not, that doesn't have a good, and he'll talk about more or less intense, right? That doesn't have a high degree of intensity. And a shift that occurs where there's nothing, right, in the actual that corresponds to it, okay? And to see that, maybe the love example is probably not as good, right, as, let's say, an example of a friendship, right, a long friendship, in which you can have intensities, right, that are happening between them that can sort of raise and lower at points without it having any effect on what the character of that relationship is, right? It's not appearing in the relationship, right? That's how I think of that. Now you might want to say, well, yeah, but isn't it often the case, right, that a shift in intensity, right, in the virtual is going to have an effect on the action? I think the answer is yes, right? But I think you can have shifts in the virtual intensities without necessarily having them have an effect, right, on identities. That's the claim I want to make. Okay? All right. Good. Okay, so now we okay so far, right? Right. I want to use one other example just because he uses the example, right? I want to use it briefly, right? So we were talking about love, Anna, but then you walked in the room and we just decided to move to something else, right? Okay. And this is an example of numbers. Okay. He talks about numbers in terms of the ordinal numbers and cardinal numbers, right? And because I wrote this down because I always forget which is which, right? Okay, right. The ordinal number is like first, second, third, right? And cardinal is 1, 2, 3, right? So ordinal numbers, right, have relationships to each other, right? First comes before second, comes before third, right? Cardinal is just a matter of counting, okay? So it can be, let's suppose, right, I was going to have you guys count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Cardinally, I could go the other way around, right? Right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Won't make any difference. Cardinally, it's just a matter of the numbers themselves, okay? Ordinally, right? Let's suppose I'm going to say, okay, the people who are going to leave the room are going to do say first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, right? That now it will change things if I say no, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, okay? So, right. Cardinal numbers are simply matters of counting. Ordinal numbers are relational. Okay? And what Deleuze claims is that the ordinal precedes the cardinal. Right? That you have relationships of firstness, secondness, thirdness before you have the numbers. Or put it another way, numbers are used to mark first and foremost ordinal relationships. Then they take on their own, once you have math, takes on its own character, right? But his claim is that you have relationality first, right? Relation of the ordinals first, and you have, right, the cardinal numbers second, okay? Right. So now, right, all of these, right, are ideas tied up with, right, the primacy first of relations over identities, and what we've added, right, because that's the differential field is, right, a field of relationality, and what we've added is that field of relationality has intensities which are virtual intensities that will break out at certain points under certain conditions, right, into different actualities. So he's begun to answer the question of how we move from the virtual to the actual. Okay, but the way he often describes it, now, Steen, I want to come back to something we were talking about a moment ago, right? The way he describes it, it's always sounds as though it's a one-way deal, right? In other words, what happens is there's stuff happening in the virtual, right, and it breaks out into the actual. But as we've seen it, and I hope that we've seen this, it's that the virtual and actual are tied in together. And because they're tied in together, right, that breaking out can happen not simply, right, and maybe often not, or maybe often just not, through just changes in the virtual, right, but through what's happening in the actual that affects the virtual. And this is going to be important in thinking about therapeutic work, right? Right? Because any intervention that you make is going to be an actual intervention, right? You're going to say something, right? Or you're going to do something, right? And in that saying or doing something, right, you're intervening on an actual / virtual field, right, in such a way as to have one effect or another, right? And maybe that effect, right, will be an effect, right, that will change something, right? Use the word phase, right? Phase change, but it will be a phase change. Something will appear that has not appeared before, right? Something gets created. And if it's the case that we don't know, as we've seen over and over again, right? That we don't know what the virtual is capable of. One of the things this means is that every intervention that you make, right, in the course of discussion with someone has got to be an experiment. Right? And not only is every intervention an experiment, but every intervention is an experiment that's particularly fraught at moments or at places of intensity. Right? Because different things can break out and we don't always know what they are. Right? So, in the case of water, again, this is why water is a good first example, but then it becomes really limited as an example, right? Right? You put enough energy in water, and it's generally going to do the same thing. Okay? Right? But, right, in the dynamics, as you know, of relationships, you've got a bunch of people, like a family in a room, right? There's various intensities that could break out in various ways. Charlotte, I hope I'm not too close to home on this one, right? Right? And you're not, because it's a much more complex field, right? And it's going to have a bunch of intensities in it that can break out, right? In ways in which, right, one doesn't expect, right? And, right, this can happen, right, in therapeutic intervention. It can happen, right, in sort of a set of personal interactions, right? And again, you don't always know, right? So, for instance, okay, now I'm doing the true confessions. My parents divorced. My father remarried, right? And let's just say that the person he remarried was not what you'd call a model of goodwill. She isn't the person who will hold up in front of other people as a stellar personality that's welcoming into your home. You're getting the point here, right? So, and I put up with this for 24 years, right? And one day I lost it, right? I mean, she said something, and I sort of gave a little warning, but even I was surprised at what happened next, right? I went off, right? I mean, and I turned around and I basically gave what seemed to me at the point 24. Hey, this doesn't have to be a note, does it? I know it's already on the tape, but like what seemed to me like 24 years of frustration, right? But of course, it couldn't be if Deleuze, it's not 24 years of frustration, because that would assume the frustration's already there as an identity, right? So what happened was, right, there was a set of intensities, right? Some of them, right, had been building for a certain amount of time, and it broke out as that thing rather than something else, okay? And again, I was surprised by it. Apparently, according to my wife, I was the only one who was surprised by this. But in any event, right? You have these moments, and then you have these intensities that break out, okay? And this is how this occurs. Now the question then becomes, how do we think about these intensities, okay? And that's going to be the next step, intensities as opposed to extensities. So here's what I was going to suggest at this moment, right? That we're all here. Can we just take just a few minutes, talk about terms you've heard in Deleuze, even if you haven't been here before, terms you've heard in Deleuze, and I'll just make a list of them, which I was going to make over here. And then for next time, what I'm going to try to do, that's going to be the structure discussion next time. I'm going to try to bring those terms in and show you how they all fit with the larger structure. Right? So when we generate that, take a quick break, and then, okay? All right, so just start throwing terms at me here. These are Deleuze, things you've heard about. Deleuze, this is a term Deleuze uses, right? You've heard this term, right?
Affect.
What?
Affect.
Affect, okay, good.
Machine.
Yeah, machine, definitely machine. Okay, Thomas.
The power to be affected.
Okay,
Yeah, it's a little over there.
good.
Desire.
desire, good. Rhizome, right? Got the rhizome?
Yeah,
Got it.
Entropy.
He talks about entropy there. It's not a central concept for him. I wonder, should we... Let's leave that one go, because it's not. It does appear in this, but it's not. It's not as central to some Deleuze kind of concept.
Abstract machine. But it's on the machine.
Yeah. Actually, an abstract machine is slightly different. So yeah, that's worth putting out on its own. Abstract machine.
The body without organs.
Oh God, I hate that one.
The same again?
Body without organs.
Yeah, I've always found that one difficult. So okay, this will make me come to terms with it. Okay, Thomas.
I'm not sure, but something about this time concept. I'm not sure if we could
Yeah.
call it time image or
Yeah.
movement image.
We might be able to. That's a whole book. But,
I know
but
that.
we,
But
yeah.
there's been a little bit about memory today.
He does it, and that thing that you read refers to the second chapter, which we didn't read.
Okay.
That whole discussion is in the second chapter. Maybe we can do something on time.
Smooth and dry.
Yeah, good. Smooth, dry. Was that
Differences.
differences? That's going to come. That's going to come. This difference is going to come back when we talk about this. Good. Are we good for the moment? Do we want to? Yeah, for the moment. Okay.
We might also, maybe with the machine thing, do something with assemblages.
Yeah, assemblage. Yeah. Actually, that's going to come with the abstract machine. Okay. And what we'll do is this. Why don't we take? Want to take a 5-minute break? We'll take a 5-minute break, and then if stuff comes, we can always just list this some more, right? So take 5 minutes. We come back, then we finish up. Good. Think about that. Okay. Yeah, I get.
Is there going to be a study group on that?
I actually on there's a person used a phrase there. A guy said he said something like he's what's the last quote? Read it, because look at the back. The last quote, first line, I think it says. Is it? We know.
May is something of a legend.
Something of a legend, and so one of my colleagues wrote back and said, "Is academics dead? Have we completely lost the ability, right, to think at all?" Right? So he read this thing, but okay, all right. So let me stop and ask first. What we've been doing, right? And this is this was all the hardest part, right? Was trying to get a sense of how it is, right, that the virtual actualizes itself, right, through intensity. So we're really trying to get an initial understanding. What is intensity? How does it work? Things like that, right? And he has 3 different aspects of it, right? But I think they're going to be easy to sort out if we've got the general idea, right? So first, let me ask questions or thoughts left over, right, from this the general discussion of what intensity is, how it works, what its place is in Deleuze's thought. Good. Okay. Man, it looks like you're puzzling. Yes. No. You okay?
I'm okay.
You're okay. Okay.
I like puzzling.
Okay. Good. Good. Okay. So he's got he in the text he has 3 qualities, and he contrasts intensities with extensities. And Deleuze is always doing this, right? It's this or this or this, right? It's always, he has a lot of binaries, right? So extension is what is out there, right? And what is out there are identities, right? And he uses the term qualities, right? So particular colors are qualities, right? But we can think of identities broadly. In other words, identities don't have to be the identity of this person or that person. Oh, that is an identity, right? Right. But they can be the identities of things. They can be identities of colors. Anything, right? That we could say can. I want to be careful of this because I know you've gotten onto the things that can be sensed, right? So we could say anything that we can perceive, I suppose, would be right. Or that we can now I'll come back to what you said, anything we can conceive, right? These would be qualities, identities, right? So we're thinking of identities in the very broad sense here, okay? Right. And they would be, right, in extension, okay? The intensities, and by the way, when I put the virtual and the intensities in parentheses, this was to indicate this was all virtual here, right? And it breaks out into the actual, right? And the actual is where, right, the extension is, okay? Okay, so, right, 3 qualities of intensity. The first is, he says, they are necessarily unequal, right? Now, right, by unequal, he doesn't necessarily mean, right, that one sort of, that it's just comparative, one is greater than the other, right? But they are things that somehow come into tension. Right? And these things that come into tension, he says, is in one passage right near the beginning, right? He says this thing, I'll read it, but it would be, actually it's on the very first page, so it's, right, it's in the very first paragraph because the paragraph is a page and a half long. He says, intensity is the form of difference insofar as this is the reason of the sensible. Now, every intensity is differential, right, by itself a difference.
Is that the beginning of chapter 5?
Beginning of chapter 5, first page, right, I don't want to say 20 lines down, okay? He says, every intensity is an E/E prime, where E itself, capital E, refers to small e/E prime, right? And small e to smaller e plus, right? So he sometimes talks about this as being, right, series and series of series, right? So it's as though you have, right, an E and an E prime, and this E, right, is the product of an E and an E prime, and this E is the product of, let's say, I don't know, double E, right, and double E prime, and the same for this, and the same for this, okay? So it keeps breaking, and he talks about this idea of series interacting in a series, right, of series, and there's an inequality between them, right? Now, one way to understand this, right, is to go back to the examples, right, that we've been working with, right? So, a simple example, if you've just got 2 things, right, you have, let's say, 2 people, right? Think of the love relationship. You've got 2 people, right? And those, and there is a tension between them. Right? Now, remember, this word tension doesn't necessarily have to mean anything bad, right? We say there's intensities, right, between them, and those intensities, right, themselves, right. If we look at each of the terms here, let's say we look at this person, right, this person is composed, right, of a variety of intensities that gave them, right. We can say that intensity that yielded the intensity over there, right? And those things, right, are composed of intensities, right? So that there is, we could say, it's relations all the way down, right? Now he always does it as 2-place, right? But it doesn't have to be 2-place, right? It can be a relationship among, X number of places, right? But the idea is, right, that somehow there are tensions, right? So there's the tension here. That's we can say that's, right, the field of their love relationship. Within each term, right, there are tensions. Maybe one's history gives one certain orientations to things that one will, feel more emotional under certain circumstances, and they happen to be in these circumstances, right? And those things go further down, and so in the end, what you have, right, is a field of pure relationality. Okay? And so the unequal refers not necessarily to the greater and the lesser, right, but simply to the fact that where you have, right, intensities, right, you have things that are marked by certain tensions, right? They are unequal in the sense that they're not simply sort of quietly on the same plane. Okay? So that's one thing. Okay? He says it's a matter of affirmation versus negation. This goes back to stuff that we talked about before. In thinking about this, he says in this text, in the reading for today, right, he says that negation, right, is difference. He says seen from the underside, seen from the wrong end, right? That if we think of, let's spend just another minute just going back to Hegel, right? When we talked about Hegel, right, we said that things happen through opposition and negation. You have a situation, there's a tension, right? Something opposes it, right? That opposition, right, creates another situation. So everything moves by negation, right? By something happening, something negating it. Right? He wants to think not in terms of the negative, but in terms of the positive, right? So all right, I'm going to make sure I get the right pen here. Okay, this pen. All right. So where for Hegel, let's see. Okay, you have a situation, right? Calls it the thesis, right? You have the antithesis, right? There's a tension between them, breaks out. You have a synthesis, which becomes a new thesis, right? And an antithesis. Okay, and so what's happening is history's progressing through denials, right? This denies that, which denies that. Then you get something new. Then it sets up its own denial. So history unfolds in Deleuze's view, when he looks at Hegel, negatively, right? But he wants to see the unfolding of things not negatively, but positively. Okay? So how does he see it as positive? Right? Well, if we think of it in terms of the intensities, right, then the intensities, in fact, are creative. Right? What happens is you have a virtual field. That virtual field operates through creation. Right? And that creation operates through the breakout of intensities. So what you have now is not the unfolding of reality through a constant negation, everything turning against things, but the unfolding of reality through a constant creation. And we'll come back to this when we talk about the eternal return. Right? And so if the unfolding of reality is a constant creation, right, then he thinks intensities he uses the term affirmative. Right? What do they affirm? He doesn't use this term, but I would say they affirm creation. Right? They affirm the unfolding of reality as a creative process rather than a negative process. Right? As something that yields, we could say, I'll use the term, we want to come back to this next one, something that yields joy, right? Rather than and Hegel uses the term, this is Hegel's term, the labor of the negative. So, thinking in terms of intensities then is thinking affirmatively in terms of creation, not negatively in terms of denial. Let me stop. Does that make sense? Or should we linger over that a bit? Let me check. Matthias, where are you at with that? That feels good to you. Okay. Let me check. Rita. Yes, okay? Okay. Any thoughts about that? That's okay. Okay. All right, so he says that intensities are implicating and implicated, right? Right. They're implicating, right, in that they create extension, they create qualities, they create identities. Right? But they are also implicated in the identities that they create. Right? Right. This comes back to the idea, right, that we talked about a bit before, which is that when the virtual actualizes, it doesn't simply cease to be there. Right? It's still there. Right? And it's still there in the actual itself, structured differently depending on the actual, right? But it remains there. So it is implicated, right? And obviously it implicates the actual, creates it, and remains implicated in it. And the term that he uses oftentimes, he'll talk about implications, perplications, complications, right? And they'll have pli in them. And that's on purpose, right? Right? Because the root of pli is fold, right? Right? And this is the idea is to use the term that he often uses later, right? The virtual unfolds into the actual, right? And the virtual remains folded into the actual that it unfolds, And therefore, things can unfold in another way as well. So the process of reality is a continuous process of folding and unfolding, right? That's why, and that's where this notion of, right, the implicating, complicating, he uses the term perplicating, right? Right? All of these have to do with this idea of folding and unfolding, right? So think of it this way. I want to come back to an example we used earlier, and for folks who haven't had before, this might be helpful. I discussed the development of the infant brain, right? So in the infant brain, right? The infant brain is something that could be many different things. Right? In other words, like who you are isn't wired into your brain. When you're an infant, right? Who you are is not already there. It's not just a matter of, if you hang around long enough, you'll unfold, right? Right. What happens is, right, that the you that is there could become many different things. Right? You can't become anything, but you can become many different things. Right? So we might think of the brain, the infant brain, right, as a virtual field of difference. Right? Doesn't have any identities in it. Right? You're not there. Right? And there aren't a set of possible yous there, one of which will get chosen. Right? But you, who you are, through the development of your brain, right, unfolds. How does it unfold? Right? You remember the way it unfolds is usually through habituation. Right? You get that certain synapses get reinforced, and you have the myelin sheath go around, and so you become as the myelin sheath is forming around certain synaptic connections. There's a development of you, right? Your personality starts to get developed through that. Okay. So what's happening is you through the developments through your brain development, you are becoming actualized, right? And that actual you, right, now is, we could say, the unfolding of the virtual field that is your infant brain, or that was your infant brain. Okay. But right, that brain is still there and can be unfolded in other ways as well. Right? And so the fact, it's not like, right, it's not like you're at, I mean, the unfolding brain is not like choosing from a menu. Like when the dish comes, that's the dish. You don't get to choose anything else, right? We can say the menu's still there, right? So you can become something else, but you've got now to, right, work on yourself to become something else. You can't just choose it, right? And why can't you just choose it? Because the actual affects the virtual. It isn't simply, right, this one-way process that anything can happen. The structure of the actual also affects the virtual. What you can become and how you can become it, right, is still an open field. But that open field is one that is still structured by the actual that you are at that moment. Okay? Right? Put this another way, right? The intensities, right, the intensities in your brain, right, may implicate certain personality traits, which then, right, which then they remain implicated in, right, with a different structure. Right? Maybe the intensities are elsewhere from where they used to be, right? And therefore can implicate something else. Or just go back to the folding, right? That you unfold, who you are unfolds in a certain way, right? But the virtue remains there, right? So it is folded in that which unfolds, and there you can unfold other ways. But the other ways in which you unfold, right, are not going to be irrelevant from the particular unfolding that you are now. Now let me use another example, right? In counseling work, right? So in conversational work, right, what happens is, right, that you work with someone, and what they can, and this will be, I want to talk narratively here, right? What their lives can become is, as we saw, right, over and over again, not a matter simply of discovering the things that are there to liberate them, but rather, right, what can be created. Right? There's a story or a set of stories that they're living. The question is, right, what stories can be created, right, from, right, from the room in which you're operating. And that what you don't know what stories can be created. Right? You may learn as you talk with them the stories that can be created. And in creating those stories, that is to say, in actualizing new stories, right, you at the same time may be helping them to actualize other ways of living. You don't know what they all are, right? But these are unfoldings of ways of living. But now, let's suppose you've worked with the person for a while, right? You work with the person for a while, and it isn't that they can't unfold in new ways and have other stories, but unfolding in those new ways and having those new stories will always have in the background, right, the stories that you work with them on. So let's suppose you work with them on a set of stories, right? Mila, go back to this example. It was the one you were reading. It was the kid and belongingness, right? Yeah. Okay. So we were discussing one day that the idea of belongingness, and Mila, correct me if I'm not remembering this right, that this was something, like a theme that Michael White was working with a kid that it turns out they wanted, yes?
Yeah, we were talking about how to create criteria so we can make, we can evaluate effects.
Right, right.
So he created, they had a conversation and the theme of belongingness emerged as a possible criteria.
Good.
Yeah.
Right, and so now belongingness becomes part of the story, right? The kid tells about where he's headed or what he would like or things like that. Now, yeah, good? Okay, right. So now let's imagine, right, that becomes part of the story, and that let's say the kid is looking for it, right, recognizing it when it's there, creating situations in which belongingness will be something that will come up for them. They do all that, right? Right. And having done all that, let's suppose that you continue to work with them, right, and they want they say they want something else. They have a sense of belongingness, but let's say they want another type of self-development. We don't even have to worry about what it is. Okay. That might involve the creation of a new story, or the change of a story, or an addition of a story. But that story is going to be created out of the elements that are currently already there, which is to say, right, the way the actualization has occurred will affect the possible stories that can be told. Right? So you can't tell a story, right? Let's suppose you get to a place of belongingness. You can't tell a story in which belongingness will not somehow have an effect, right? Because that's in the actual that is now part of this person's history, right? Just as when you have when the brain unfolds a certain way, you might shift it to do something else through habituation, right? But you have to shift it based on where the person's at, where the brain is at. Same thing when you work with a person therapeutically, right? You have to shift them from the virtual field has to shift based on the actualizations, right, that the person finds themselves in. Right? Now, that going back to the folding, right? Right. If you
might say that the virtual field might be limited by the actual field.
Yes, limited.
It's not every story that goes.
Yes. Yes, I'm puzzling over the word limited. It would be limited, but sometimes I think of limited as just borders, right? But it's more than borders because it will also affect what goes on in the unfolding of the virtual itself, right? So let's start with the infant brain, right? The infant brain becomes certain things, right? It becomes like this personality, say my personality, right? And I can become other things, and it's true that who I am now limits the kinds of things that I can become. Right? But I think it also helps structure the kind of things I can become. So it's both limiting and structure, I would say. Yeah? Yeah, fair. Good.
Just because limiting, that's negative, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not false to say it's limiting. In other words, it may be that sort of having become... I'll give you, actually, here's a limitation, right? Having become a philosopher who has not, like, used hands, right? That terribly much, right? The eye-hand coordination goes down, right? So the philosopher is not going to become like a pianist, right? At some point, right? Or, right, in my case, and you know this goes close to home, right? Right, the person whose brain is structured in such a way that they never actually learned another language, when they try to learn another language, just say, for example, Danish, right? They find it's not so easy to do, right? There are limitations on what they can do because their brain is, right? So I think it's right to say that there are limitations, but there's also structurings. There's both, okay? Yeah, thought. Good? Okay? All right, so we see this so far, okay? So, right, the intensities then, right, are, right, they come from tensions, they work affirmatively, right, and they are implicating and implicated. Right? They appear, right, in reality, their structure can change.
And does everyone know the meaning of the word plea? That's a fold.
Right, plea,
So
to,
you see it on the other.
oops, right, this is the board one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Plea means fold, right? That's why he uses these. Okay. And he actually has a book on Leibniz that's called The Plea, the Fold, right? In which he talks about he talks about Leibniz in this kind of context, the folding and unfolding. Okay, right. I mean, one way that you could that some people have used to think of it is, you guys know origami, right? So you have a piece of paper, right? And you fold it into origami, and right, you can unfold it into something else, right? But once it's folded into something, right, I want you to imagine, once it's folded into something, you can't unfold it completely again, right? Let's say that's against the rules, okay? Right? So once it's folded into something, you can fold it into something else, but what you can fold it into next, right, is based in part on what you folded it into. You can't just fold it into anything, right? You can fold it into only those things which this particular figure, right, would allow. And there'd be many of them, and we don't know how many of them, right? But you can't just fold anything. That would be the limitation. And what you can fold, right, is right. But the thing that you're folding, right, the paper itself, right, that would be the equivalent of the virtual field, right? That's the virtual field that you can fold in certain ways, right? And once you folded something, right, we might say, right, that there are certain points at which folding becomes easier, right, and those will be the intensities, right, whereas the stuff that would be more resistant would not be the intensities, right? Does that image help at all? Okay. I mean, what I like about it is it involves folding, which is sort of the idea he's got. Okay, so now, I think I just want to do one more thing, which is going to, I think, bring together what we might think of, right, as the really positive, affirmative aspect of Deleuze's thought, which is to go back to the eternal return. Okay. Now, let's just to recall, right, the notion of the eternal return comes from Nietzsche. The eternal return has sometimes been thought of as an ethical doctrine, and sometimes been thought of as an ontological doctrine, right? Doctrine of what there is. The most standard interpretation is that it's an ethical doctrine. I'll explain in a minute, right? What that means, right? So the standard interpretation of the eternal return is it's an ethical doctrine. Right? Deleuze, unsurprisingly, opts for the other interpretation, right? It's an ontological doctrine. Right? What is it? The eternal return is an ethical doctrine. Right? and in Nietzsche's writings, he's really, he seems to go back and forth. It's unclear whether he thinks that the eternal return actually happens, that would be an ontological doctrine, or if it's just a way of thinking, right? He calls it, he asks, what can pass the test of the eternal return? So what's the test of the eternal return? Right? The test of the eternal return is, what would be, right, if you had to choose to live your life, this same life, over and over and over again, eternally, right? What would you choose to do? Right? Would you choose the life that you got? Right? Would you choose different? Right? And one of the things that the eternal return is supposed to do, and this is just one of them, right, is get rid of pettiness. Right?
Get rid of
being petty. Not pity. Right.
Petit, like in small.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So like pettiness would be like I'm jealous of my colleague because they got a larger office than I did, right? Or if like somebody I don't like, right, has something good happen to them, I feel like I gotta do something to make them feel bad about it, right? That sort of thing, right? Yeah, that would be pettiness, I think, right? So, right, petty is little, right? But okay, so one of the things that the doctrine of the eternal return as an ethical doctrine is supposed to do is, right, have you focus on the things that you think are really worth doing, right? Like if you had to do it over and over again, right, would you really, right, eternally be pissed that your colleague, right, got an office, right? If you had to be pissed, like, infinitely many times about it, right, would you do that, right? Or would you try to, like, write a great novel, right? Or would you try to do something that was significant, right? And so for Nietzsche, right, the test of the eternal return brings out the projects that seem to be worth doing, right? Now that's the eternal return as an ethical doctrine. That's to say, as a test of how you would want to live. Okay? Sometimes though, Nietzsche does this strange thing, which he writes as though, no, everything actually does return, right? There are moments where he says, no, the eternal return happens, everything returns, and he calls it, right, sometimes, Nietzsche, right, the eternal return of the same, okay? Right. Now, if we take this idea of the eternal return of the same, then it seems we have a very un-Deleuzian doctrine, right? Because the same would be the identities, right? So the same identities keep returning. Right? And that's how people have interpreted Nietzsche. When they interpret it as an ontological, ontological, right? What there is, the doctrine of what there is. Right? They've interpreted it as, right, that history is cyclical. Same things just happen over and over again. Right? May come in different guises, but it's essentially the same thing. And so for Deleuze, right, he reinterprets the eternal return in a way that's going to be in keeping with what we've been talking about. And one way to put this, and this would be ironic and a bit uncharitable, right? But we'll start here, right? Is that Deleuze thinks that when Nietzsche says the word the same, what he means is different, right? Not the same. Right? Of course, right? Right? We've been at this like 7 weeks now. Oh, is this obvious, right? Like any idiot can figure that out. But so the way he sort of gets around that, right, is he says, well, the eternal return is the return of the same, right? But the same that he's talking about is not identities. The same he's talking about is difference in itself, right? That sameness, that thing which returns, is difference. Now, we can think of it this way, then I want to go to a couple of quotes, right? We can one way to think about it is this, right? That the identities of things come and go. And we know this. We see them. You know, people are born, they die, colors fade, right? Ideas go out of fashion, right? Identities come and go.
Would you say concepts go out of fashion? Not ideas go out?
Yeah. Concepts go. Ooh, you got me on that. Yes. Touche, right? I'm going to hold your hand at dinner. Yes. No.
Certainly intentional.
What's that?
That's certainly intentional.
Yes.
So identities come and go, right? Qualities come and go, okay? But, right, the creative character remains, right? There's always the creative character, right? If reality is the way Deleuze describes it, then what always comes back is this ability to create. Which is to say, what always comes back, right, is the unfolding of the virtual. Right? The actualities come and go. But what always returns is the virtual in its creative power.
Could you say that the eternal return is the return of the relationships?
Yes, I want to get rid of the word the. It's not the same relationships.
Return of relationships.
That's it. Right. Yeah. The eternal return is the return of relationships or of virtual relationality. Yes. That would be the eternal return. Right? Meta.
It's this concept of swarm of
Swarm. Yeah.
Does it have any relation to that?
It does.
Yeah.
Not eternal return. Okay. The swarm is... The swarm is the movement in difference, in that realm in the virtual realm of difference, right? Right. That can be more or less intense. So the swarm is that movement, right? So it's not that. I'll put it this way, right? It's not that a particular swarm returns, but swarming itself.
As a movement.
Yeah, that returns. Would that be in keeping with what you understand? Yeah, that would be right. Okay? Right. But now, this means, right, that he thinks of the world, right? He thinks of reality. He thinks of being, thinks of what there is, as a fundamentally creative process. And in taking up Nietzsche the way he does, the eternal return, right, as the eternal return of difference, or come back to meta, the eternal return of swarming, right? The creativity, right? He sees opens up a relation to reality which is fundamentally affirmative, right? Sees us as engaged in potential projects of creation, as long as we're not trying to grip onto the identities, right? But allow ourselves, right, to recognize, right, the full reality of creation. Remember what he said in the beginning of the third chapter. Right? He says, it's always an issue of somebody managing not to know what everybody knows. Right? Somebody not gripping onto the identity, right, that everybody's gripping onto, the good sense and the common sense. Right? So, right, now the quotes. Right? Now, this should be fairly easy to locate in the reading, except you seem to the wrong reading. He's got a different edition, right? And I guess, Millie, you sent out the page numbers, and he was tired last night, so he started reading the page numbers.
Rookie mistake.
Now, for us, it's page, us, that's to say, the really cool edition. 243, right?
How many pages in chapter 5?
Right. Now, what it is well, page 244 in the reading, right? I said in our page it was up to 244. Where did it end for the people in the other editions?
This edition ended at 305.
305. That was where the reading for today stopped.
Yes.
305. And then there's a third edition. That's Alan and Benedicta's edition. Where did your reading end for today?
319.
Yeah.
319? Good, perfect. Okay, so it's the last paragraph. Right. So at the last paragraph, it should say it is because nothing is equal.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes? Let's see. We good? Thomas, we good? Because nothing is equal? No. Wait, let's make sure. I want to make sure we're together.
It's like 20 pages from
Okay.
this page.
You got it? What page? What page?
It's in the middle of 305.
Middle of 305. Okay. It is because nothing is equal, because everything bathes in its difference, its dissimilarity, and its inequality, even with itself. It is because of that everything returns, right? Or rather, everything does not return. What does not return is that which denies eternal return, that which does not pass the test. Right? It is quality, extension, right? It is quality and extensity which do not return, identities which do not return. Right? Insofar as insofar as within them difference, the condition of eternal return is cancelled. So to the negative, right? So to the identical, the similar, and the equal, insofar as these constitute forms of indifference, not difference. Right? He says, so to God, along with it, the self as the form and guarantee of identity. None of it returns, right? It all passes, it all fades, right? So then switch over, right? Now I want to go down maybe 10 lines, right? Let's see if. Yeah. So this would be just the hard law of explication.
Yeah.
Right. The hard law of explication is that what is explicated, right, goes into extension, right, is explicated once and for all. That's it. The ethics of intensive quantities has only two principles. Affirm even the lowest. Don't explicate oneself too much. That is to say, what gets explicated once. It appears. It disappears. But right, the process of explication, the process of swarming, the process of creating, right, the process of intensities breaking out, right, into new forms, explicating themselves in other ways, right, in which they remain implicated. That process is eternal. That's the eternal return. Okay, so that which is the identities come and go, right? The process remains. Or put it another way, reality is a process of continuous creation, in which rather than holding on to the identities that present themselves to us as all there is, we can ask ourselves, and we can ask ourselves at every moment, because it's always there, right? What might we create? Right? What might we make? Interesting.
But this kind of ontology of that the extension and identities don't return, only different return. Does that mean that the usual difference between the general and the particular, is it cancelled out in Deleuze's thought? Can we talk of something general and particular if nothing stable returns? Is there anything general left?
I'm not sure. Steve, help me out with what you mean about in general. Nothing general left.
In general? Like say, as soon as you speak about something in general, tables in general.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Or
Good.
is it only
Good.
like, because sometimes, and I know that singularity in Deleuze's language has several meanings, but sometimes other writers like Masumi and other people are talking about strict singularity,
right,
as an ontological ground, instead of an idea of like something, that there's something general and there's something particular.
Yes. Okay. Good.
Do you understand what
Yeah, I do. Well, I'm going to answer what I think your question is, and then you'll tell me if I just understood you. Okay? The qualities, we could say, particulars come and go. Particular qualities come and go. The chair's not going to be there. I'm not going to be there. Right? You could say, is it possible to say there will always be tables? Well, probably not with any confidence. Right? Is it possible to say, right, that the concept of table, right, will always be there? Okay, that would be the general. Right, now we're at the general, right? Yeah. Okay, and I suspect what Deleuze would probably say is probably not even that, right? Right, because the concept of table, it doesn't exist in some transcendent universe, so it has to be immanent, right? So as human beings come and go, right, tableness is going to come and go as well, right? So I would suspect that it's not only the particulars, right, but perhaps the generals, right, general that fades as well. Of course, unless we're saying that difference in itself is a general, right? But he's denying that. He applies the idea of general to concepts. See what I mean? So I think they'll, if I'm thinking about this right, they all go. But first, did I understand your question?
Yeah. So the idea about the general and particular, which is a very bold idea, is that would form a part of the dogmatic image of thought, which he rejects.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we'll put it this way: the idea that they're just there, right, and simply to be recognized, that would form part of the dogmatic image of thought, and you can see why. Because if it's just there, it's transcendent. It's not based on some particular reality, the immanent reality of change. It's got to be a transcendent. So and as a transcendent, it's part of the dogmatic image of thought.
But does that also mean that everything that comes into the universe, because of the difference, because the same doesn't return, is different?
Everything?
That everything that comes into being is different? That there's, that you have a chair and you have another chair, but they're still different? Singular?
Yes, but here, Steve, we've got to be really careful here, right? Right. Let's say you've got two chairs, right? The two chairs, well, they're clearly different in a derived sense. They're not the same chair. But that's not what he's interested in when he talks about difference, right? He's talking about the thing that gives rise to them in the first place. Right? So they are different. Right? Doesn't mean they can't fall under the same concept, okay? But the reason they can fall under the same concept is because they're actualizations of difference that fall under itself an actual concept. But all of that, right, the chairs, the concepts, those things will come and go, right? And what will remain is the creativity itself.
So in the realm of the actual, we can still talk about the general and the particular?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's no problem at all. Yes, right. In the realm of
because they are concepts.
Right, because they're concepts, you're pressing your luck here, buddy. Right. Because they're concepts. Yeah, and remember, right, there isn't simply difference, right? There's actualized difference as well. So we can talk about it, but we can talk about it in its own realm. But if concepts just apply, like the general particular, to what's going on in actuality, and if actuality comes and goes, so will it, right? So will the general and the particular. Good? Okay, so now here's the situation, right? I realized this morning that I did not order cake. I know. And I couldn't order cake because I couldn't face that guy another time without pre-ordering cake. And so just right, on my behalf, right, I have ordered a cake for next week already, which will be ready, and it's been paid for. Ordered and paid for. But, right, as consolation, right, Thomas brought a bottle of wine last week. I gave a presentation at a high school. They gave me some wine. So we have a couple bottles of red wine. And for those who don't like red wine, I would be happy to bring out my bottle of bourbon. Right? So I will bring these out for those as wants, right? And I hope this will at least stand as consolation. And I stand abashed and humiliated before you. Yes.
Reading for next time.
No reading. It's this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm gonna take concepts that people are, and then fold this as fold is actually not, I guess, a good word there. Right. Try to show how these terms, which you've been, you've heard, and you can email me others if you want, right? But how these terms, which you've seen in one context or another, how they work within the context of this larger framework. Because what I said, we started difference and repetition. The reason I want to do this is because everything goes back to this, right? This is the text for Deleuze, right? So I'll relate all this stuff. So we'll just keep it on the board.